lying with their head out the back. How did he get in? Through the door. How would you expect to get into it? Oh, dear, so it works.
I, for one, felt that it was just devastating. The bleakness and it was an eerie quality, you know. It was sort of like every horror story you've ever read rolled into one story.
5, 4.
Here.
100 million Americans watched the television movie the day after. It was a window on a nightmarish world, but it gave an extraordinary view of one superpower's nuclear anxieties, weighed against a resurgence of pride in its military forces. In Lawrence, Kansas, where many families were in the movie, and in homes around the country, for one night in November, America's central nervous system was wired into an entertainment network where the entertainment was the horror of nuclear war. Even in the heart of Middle America, it was a shock to find in a suburban park the shell of a nuclear missile, erected like a shrine. In 1964, when the United States Navy presented the Polaris missile to the city of Lawrence, Americans were a lot more comfortable about their country's clear nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. But the Russians have bridged the missile gap since then. And today, even in these most patriotic of Midwestern towns, there's a growing anxiety about the chances of a nuclear war. A peaceful and prosperous community of 50,000 was forced to contemplate the idea of nuclear destruction when television staged its tragedy here. It was perfect casting, Main Street, America. Local farmers and people from the university, a healthy mix. All that's decent in the American dream. Kansas University students who enjoy their football team's homecoming parade were given different costumes for the television war movie. Their clothes were torn, their hair singed, their fresh-faced innocence changed by the movie makers to a look of nuclear despair. Even those with bit parts would never forget this media phenomenon, with its intense publicity, controversy, and political debate.
Does the film take a political stand?
Yeah. The film says that nuclear war is bad for you, and that if a nuclear bomb goes off, it's going to ruin your entire day. It does not address political issues, however. It does not advocate arming or disarming, SALT II or START. The film is not about generals. It is not about politicians. It is not about global strategy. It attempts to show you, without editorializing, to the best of our ability, what nuclear war is going to look like.
What it would look like on the Great Plains of Kansas, what it would look like after a war in Europe escalates to a superpower exchange over these clear blue skies, what it would look like with Kansas City gone, and in this surrounding farmland, all of the invisible nuclear silos launching their missiles with incoming strikes from the Soviet Union. If the film's director did not intend to editorialise, there were many others who were happy to do so for him. Even before the program went to air, the nuclear freeze movement had seized on the day after as its most persuasive argument against President Reagan's nuclear build-up.
In the last election, 12 million people voted to halt the arms race. With one exception, the nuclear freeze won in every state in which it was on the ballot. It was an unprecedented, historic vote.
With unprecedented media coverage of the nuclear war film, some of President Reagan's supporters came to the University of Kansas to accuse the American broadcasting company of stampeding the nation towards unilateral disarmament.
I think, since I've not seen the film, what I'm going to be angry about is that their presentation is so one-sided, and through use of nuance or insinuation indicates that the Soviet Union is no different than the United States, or the United States no different than the Soviet Union in our approach to history, our approach to mankind, to justice, to law-abiding nations on this small, delicate, shrinking planet, and that we are as capable of starting an Armageddon Fourth World War as they are. I say Fourth World War to...
A former Californian congressman, Robert Dornan, claims President Reagan is trying to achieve a real balance in nuclear forces and would never trigger a nuclear war against the Soviet Union.
We're held in check by one of the world's most dynamic democratic processes. They are held in check by absolutely nothing. 14 geriatric old communists sitting there in the Polar Bureau who have risen up through a system from childhood as communist young pioneers that gives them a concrete block mindset in their heads that's extremely dangerous. And what's the new innovation that President Reagan has brought on the scene? To tell the Soviets and ourselves, start trading off offensive systems for defensive systems.
It was more than Cold War tension. After weeks of angry debate, publicity around the world, attacks on the movie and arguments in its defense, Lawrence was hushed. It would not have happened 20 years ago, but the movie went to air.
He got up, went to the window, looked for the bombs.
Didn't happen. It's not going to happen now.
People are crazy. But
Jason Robards and Jo Beth Williams were on the screen, but so were the thousands of residents of Lawrence, like Professor Cal Downs and his daughter Alison, who were extras in the film.
What if it does happen?
Instead of teaching his communications class at the university, Professor Downs joined the throngs fleeing a nuclear attack, with nowhere to go.
Over 300 missiles inbound now.
I still feel that the way for us to prevent this happening to the United States is through strength. Nuclear war is devastating, I'm sure, you know, and this was very good drama, and I think it makes a superb point that the people who are going to be killed in a nuclear war, it's going to be a very pathetic situation.
Alison Downs huddled with strangers dressed in rags in a tent city of the film's nuclear war victims. Yet she believes there would be many survivors from a real nuclear war.
I am a pro-defense person. I feel that we should be strong, and that is how we will need to survive. If it happens, and it's terrible, but it's something we'll have to deal with. And I do not feel that dying is the worst thing that can happen to me at this point, or to others.
Kevin, do you think there's a Star Wars generation of young people now who think that nuclear war is almost inevitable?
I think there are quite a few people that may think that nuclear war is going to come no matter what we try to do.
It was cut back from 4 hours to 2.25, re-edited, chastened and censored. But TV's Movie of the Week did, in one very important sense, become the public service announcement its makers hoped it would be. It impinged. It broke through the widespread amnesia about the existence of so many nuclear missiles and the fact that they could actually be launched from outside this town.
Eva, we've got to get down below. Listen, those missiles have all gone off.
You know, I think it was fun while they were making it. I don't think you thought about the horror. And I for one, felt that it was just devastating. The bleakness and it was an eerie quality, you know. It was sort of like every horror story you've ever read rolled into one story.
Which many of us saw this evening.
This is Lawrence, Kansas. Is anybody there? Anybody at all? Those words from the film were read at a hilltop vigil that night, led by the mayor of Lawrence, David Longhurst.
We saw our community destroyed this evening. We saw the riverfront where my son and I spent Independence Days littered with bodies. We saw civilization as we know it annihilated. We saw all the nightmares come true and the despair and hopelessness that followed. We got a glimpse of what is really at stake in a nuclear war.
On this night, many Americans we talked to seemed anxious for the world to know that their deepest longing was for peace. The morning after, Kansas authorities already were talking about upgrading their civil defense plans. Some ignored the movie's claim that no one would survive, no matter how well the sirens worked or if holes were dug in the backyards. While a great national debate raged around America over whether anyone's really in control of the nuclear arms race, the people of Lawrence held a town meeting. They wanted to prevent the day after ever coming.
And then I think of other mothers. I think of mothers in Russia who don't want their children to be involved in a nuclear war. And then I also think of mothers in other parts of the world.
The only difference is that these arguments have now reached the mainstream of the American people and the European people who've decided to wake up, look at their destinies, and who have become, after 40 years of all sorts of horrors in international relationships, have begun to come to some understanding that perhaps ordinary common people have a greater wisdom than that which is handed from government officials.
We're very pleased.
All over Kansas, all over the United States, in schools and churches, in Congress and on television, similar debates were raging in the days after the day after.
Suicide? I voted for the nuclear freeze because I felt like that we had truly arrived at the point where enough was enough. And I believe that
But in the solid heartland of America, there are still plenty of down-to-earth people who can't be upset by a TV movie. Much of the film was shot on Meadow Farm, an hour's drive from Kansas City. From this window, a young woman waved at the missile men as they went out to the underground silos buried beneath the cornfields.
Did you say may stand with
Mrs. Margaret Wolfcool has lived at Meadow Farm for more than 70 years. She knows that none of it really happened, that it was only a movie.
Unfortunately, the family, which were called the Hendrys, a mother and father and 2 small children, did not take any precaution to protect themselves from any sort of a disaster. And instead of taking refuge in a basement or some protected place, they attempted an escape in their pickup truck. And so very early in the story, they are destroyed, literally destroyed, burned to death.
With so much of your family history connected with this homestead here, what was it like to see in the movie a family killed in a fictional nuclear war?
Knowing that I was just seeing a movie, it did not really affect me adversely.
Margaret's husband Ross did a profitable deal with the movie makers who wanted to blow up his barn.
There were at least 3/4 of a mile caravan that drove in here that morning, and then when they all took their jobs and places around here and made things ready for the explosion, why, it was really exciting.
And is that how most of the farm community has looked towards the movie, that it's been more a bit of Hollywood excitement than something shocking?
I think so, because most of the people in conversation was, so they blew up your barn. And it was funny, you know. They didn't look at it as this nuclear attack that it's supposed to be playing or emphasizing. So they...
Tornadoes have twice devastated Meadow Farm. No one was killed. Ross Wolfcool is quite certain that a nuclear war would be different, that everyone here would die if there were a scenario like the day after. But he doesn't think there'll be a nuclear war.
I don't see that's going to happen, really. So I haven't given it that much thought, but then I really feel that if the Russians do have some missiles coming toward us, we ought to have some to send back.
Times like these.
President Reagan could hardly have put it better. The only way to stop the Soviets hurling missiles at America, he still maintains, is to have plenty ready to hurl back.
America seeks no new territory, nor do we wish to dominate others. We commit our resources and risk the lives of those in our armed forces to rescue others from bloodshed and turmoil and to prevent humankind from drowning in a sea of tyranny.
Hi, Wickham is surrounded by nuclear war headquarters. Come and join us.
But the bellicose statements that came out of the White House in the early months of his administration helped to swell the peace movements now sweeping Europe and America. His advisors now have to work all the harder to persuade the world that the United States policy is still no more and no less than old-fashioned deterrence.
When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Now! When do we want it? Now!
The horror of nuclear war is something that we all know about. It is simply not true that this administration has a new nuclear policy. This administration has the same nuclear policy of flexible response as that of its predecessors since 1961. And it is simply not true that the United States believes a nuclear war can be won. We are very clear that there can be no winner in a nuclear war.
According to the latest opinion polls, over 80% of Americans are now in favor of a freeze, an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States to stop the development and deployment of nuclear weapons. The Russians say they support the idea. But Mr. Reagan's administration, convinced that a freeze now would leave the Soviets ahead, want to catch up first. This simple and awesomely important debate has divided America. But it's complicated by the president's tendency to see every crisis, big and small, around the globe in terms of the superpower confrontation. So those who march and sing in favor of the freeze are protesting too against America's military build-up in Central America.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years
are other answers proclaimed by a new breed of demonstrators. They uphold America's right to be strong in Nicaragua and Grenada as much as on the nuclear chessboard. As thousands marched peacefully past the White House this November, protesting against the president's policies, the only violence came from an anti-communist mob battling with police to try to stop the march.
Dead, so is Mao. That's our freedom, do it now. Marx is dead, so is Mao. That's our freedom, do it now.
You don't think these other people have a right to march here today too?
No, communists don't have any right in Central America whatsoever. And it's our right as Americans to stand up for America and for the free world against communism. I'm sorry, that's got to be done.
So what do you think of these Americans that are marching in the street today?
KGB out. I think they're naive to think that communists are not in Central America. I think they have no right to, I think they've got no right, no understanding of what Marxism is really about and what it's doing in Central America. And I think it's us to educate those people to understand what's really happening in Central America and to support President Reagan and support what is happening our stance should be made in Central America.
Do you also support President Reagan sending Marines to Lebanon?
Yeah, we do. If it has terrorism, if Marxism and communism is involved, and it needs to be stopped. It needs somebody who is righteous and determined to make a stop in Central America or in the Middle East, anywhere that Marxism or communism is taking over around the world.
Extreme they may be, but the paradox is that most Americans join them in supporting the president's decisive action in Grenada, even while they oppose his nuclear build-up. In the aftermath of Grenada and the Lebanon, Mr. Reagan has been able to play the president's traditional trump card, a direct appeal to American patriotism. And old actor that he is, he's done it with a style that's more than matched any fictional portrayal of the Holocaust.
Grenada, we were told, was a friendly island paradise for tourism. Well, it wasn't. It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there just in time.
While critics around the world have ridiculed this latest Grenada episode of Send in the Marines, Americans overwhelmingly have praised it, hailing the great performance, a decisive one, by their commander-in-chief.
If you're looking for excitement, challenge, respect, check out the Marines.
This is Zulu 4-5. Fire for effect, over.
The United States Marine Corps. Proud, tough, and ready. If you're up to the challenge, maybe you can be one of us, the few, the proud, the Marines.
The number of young men and women seeking to join the Marines has shot up since the action in Lebanon and Grenada.
Pass your student position of attention. If you'd raise your right hand, we'll get started with the oath of enlistment. I,
John Dana Wiles. Dexter Thomas Green. Matthew William Granick.
Beverly Jean Long.
Anthony Edmund Johnson.
do solemnly swear that I'll support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
They're 17 and 18 years old, and they'll figure prominently in President Reagan's foreign policy.
And that I'll bear true faith.
I think a lot of people were scared at first, but I think now they're understanding what the military is all about.
So what is it about the Marines that makes you want to sign up today?
They're proud. They fight for my country. I mean, they're ready to protect me and my family and the whole country. And I want to be able to help support them in any way I can, and I figure I can do best by joining them.
I think in times of crises in this country, as in many others, I think people rally around the leadership. And when military forces are engaged abroad, someplace, I think the natural inclination is to support them.
At the Marine Corps station in Baltimore, Maryland, Major Kevin Kennedy has watched a surge of public feeling lift military recruitment for all of the armed forces to their best year in a decade. As nervous as most Americans are about the danger of war, support for the president usually grows once he embarks on a military course. That worries this retired admiral.
We, as a nation, have had a war nearly every 20 or 30 years. We are a nation that is accustomed to fighting wars. We are a nation of 30 million living military veterans. Our first reaction is to use military force Our second reaction is to try diplomacy. Artillery shells to be used to fight in the war.
He was a frontline naval commander and later a strategic planner at the Pentagon. But at a Washington debate on which course the United States should take now, retired Admiral Jean LaRocque pleaded for an urgent dialogue with the Russians, arguing that militarism would sweep the superpowers into an unwinnable nuclear war. To some in the audience, that makes even a career military man unpatriotic.
That people like yourself, I want you to respond to this.
We want a question.
Yeah, I want him to respond.
Could you please take your seat and then he will respond?
I would like Admiral LaRocque to respond unless he's just willing to concede that he's a KGB agent.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Would you respond to the remarks?
I would remind you in the audience that I fought in 3 wars. I don't know how many wars, Mr. Ogden, you fought in, but I can tell you that war is a very dumb way to settle differences among nations, and nuclear war, I can tell you as a strategic planner, is insane. Mr. Reagan and many of his colleagues genuinely believe that Russia is indeed the focus of evil and must be eradicated. We are embarked in the United States on a genuine crusade to save the world from communism, even if it means committing suicide ourselves.
But the American view more likely to prevail in this Cold War is that the only way to deal with the Russians is to stand up to them, move for military move.
It's been in the last 2 decades that we live in this tenuous situation that Kennedy described as the world not long remaining half slave and half free, and that will probably prevail for the rest of our life. I think that for the rest of our lives, the way to keep at least worldwide peace is through strength, a deterrent, with somewhat of a balance. And I believe that I speak for President Reagan in his goal to achieve that, and I believe he'll have a chance to go for that in a second term.
It is the conventional wisdom that President Reagan will be re-elected in 1984, despite the quagmire in the Middle East, the fighting in Central America, the tensions over the missiles in Europe, and the gloomy relations with Moscow.
The world looks to America for leadership, and America looks to the men in its armed forces, to the Corps of Marines, to the Navy, the Army. Freedom is being tested throughout the world.
Americans have always heeded this call, but it also guarantees a new year of great tension in relations with the Soviet Union.
Our heritage of liberty must be preserved and passed on. Let no terrorist question our will, or no tyrant doubt our resolve. Americans have courage and determination, and we must not and will not be intimidated by anyone, anywhere. I hope
some fear that 1984 will be the most dangerous year of what has unfolded so far of the missile age. There are many scenarios apart from the day after. A tense superpower standoff is the most realistic prediction from Washington. For Americans and the rest of us, it is indeed a Cold War Christmas.
Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas, boys and girls!
That's a pretty name. How old are you? How many fingers? This many? This many? Carolyn! Caitlin? That's a pretty name. How old are you, Caitlin? What would you like for Christmas this year?
Video games.
A gun? What are you going to do with a gun? What are you going to shoot? Target.
The issues of 1983. Who made them and who fought them?
This is the biggest issue that I remember around for 30, 40 years.
I think unemployment is just so out of hand.
Australian foreign aid to the Philippines, like any other foreign aid, is designed to carry out Australian foreign policy.
In the last Four Corners programme of the year, we look again at some of our major stories and answer some of the questions we raised in 1983.